Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. The 2019 Public Trust Research Connecting with Canadians. It's part of the Sustainability webinar series. This series aims to increase the awareness and support of sustainability platforms in the agriculture industry. My name is Caitlin Reeser and I'm hosting our webinar. A couple of housekeeping items. If you wish to ask a question, please type it in the question box and address it to the organizer, and we will make sure it gets asked at the end of the presentation. And a note, the webinar is being recorded and you will be sent a link by email tomorrow. Our moderator today is Tanya Moskale-Bear, Manager Agro-Environmental Extension with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and I will now turn it over to Tanya.
Good morning, everyone. It's Tanya Moskale-Bear. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a manager within the Agriculture and Forestry department, and I work with Public Trust and have so for about the last 4 or 5 years. This morning we are honored to have the President and CEO of the CCFI, or Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, John Jamieson. And he comes to us comes to CCFI actually new this year, since last May, I think it was. And previously it served as the Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and the Deputy Minister of Rural and Regional Development in Prince Edward Island. He previously served as the Executive Director of Prince Edward Island Federation of Agriculture and has a wealth of knowledge working with various commodity organizations. He is currently now living in Ontario, but he does still get to ride his motorcycles and does make some time for some fly fishing. John is a professional agrologist and a certified nutrient management planner and sits on the Dalhousie University's Faculty of Agriculture and the University's Faculty of Agriculture Advisory Committee, and has previously sat on the Farm and Food Care Foundation Board of Directors. So I'd like to welcome John on the last leg of his Western tour before he heads back to Ontario to present the 2019 Public Trust Research Connecting with Canadians. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Thanks, Tanya. And as Tanya mentioned, just spent the week in Alberta. On Wednesday, I spoke to the Alberta Sugar Beet Growers annual meeting. Great group. Despite having a fairly tough year, they were very positive, which was nice to see, and had a number of meetings with some other groups and companies. And yesterday I attended the Alberta Beef Conference, and there was about 650 there. So thanks for signing in, and I appreciate it. This will be as much a fairly not really cooked presentation, more conversational than anything. One of the things that I'm still getting used to after being a deputy minister for a number of years is getting out in front of people and giving presentations. And I'm glad that there's some folks in the room, because I typically don't do well with a webinar. I tend to like to feed off people. Anyway, I really appreciate the opportunity, and the deck will be available after the presentation. So don't worry whether you have to make any notes or anything like that. There's a lot of data, a lot of slides in here. And so, like I said, the presentation will be available. I've added a few items more of interest, and so I can tell a couple of stories than anything. So anyway, we'll get started. And I will be looking at the screen a little bit, because I will have to turn my head to see what we're doing here. So the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity was created in 2016. It came out of the creation of Farm and Food Care Canada, and we are loosely aligned with an organization called the Centre for Food Integrity in the US. And our mission has been to help Canada's food system. And when I talk about the food system, it's everything from farm organizations to food processors, right up to retailers and restaurants, to do that connecting with Canadians, and how you can do a better job of telling your story and connecting on the values of the people that consume our products. Now, things are changing in our organization, and 2019 certainly was a year of change. I started back in the summer of 2019, and to be honest with you, really just starting to get comfortable in the position. It's like anyone starts a new job, it takes you a little while to get your head wrapped around what you're doing. We also had a fair bit of board renewal in 2019 with the organization. Our chair is from Alberta. It's Kim McConnell, who is the original founder of AdFarm, which is an advertising agency that works in agriculture. But we added 5 new board members this year, and to broaden our scope across the food system. And one of the new members we added is Shanna Monroe, and Shanna is the CEO of Restaurants Canada. And the organization has never had that connection to the restaurants before, and I think that's an important one when you think about 30 to 35% of our food dollar is spent outside the home. And last week, Restaurants Canada had their large annual show in Toronto, and we had some of our board members there participating in that. So it's good to make that connection. We've also added Mike Dungate, and many of you may have heard of Mike. Mike was the former CEO of the Chicken Farmers of Canada, and his job is on our board is to stay connected to the supply management piece of the industry, and he brings a lot of knowledge around that, and that's a good place to be. We've added Darlene McBain, who works with Farm Credit Canada in Montreal, and Janet Riley has joined us. She was the spokesperson for the American Meat Institute for about 20 years, trained journalist, and just a fantastic asset on our board. And then our 5th new member is James Donaldson, who's with BC Food and Ag. So we've added a number of people, we've changed the leadership, and we're also looking at changing our mandate. So one of the things that we'll be doing, and I'll just take a minute to talk about this, is playing more of a coordinating role across the system in terms of building that trust and connecting with Canadians. So the last number of years, there was an organization called the Public Trust Steering Committee, which was made up of government, farm organizations, and industry. They came together to build a strategic plan for public trust in Canada. One of the things they identified as a barrier is the lack of a coordinating body. And one of the first things they asked me to do after coming into the position was to develop a plan for that coordination, which we've done, and they've accepted that plan. And it really talks about not being the boss, but being that coordinating body so that everyone can learn from each other, that we provide resources and research and the other thing. Another thing that we'll be doing over the next little bit is building a outward-facing consumer communications plan that will be led by the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. We've established a super solid communication subcommittee led by both communications and social media experts from across Canada. We also have some dietitians on there to make that connection. And we've developed a plan, and the 3 buckets that we'll be communicating in are science and technology, food safety and health, and climate change. And those are the 3 things that we think we could speak about across the food system that will resonate with Canadians. And as I was in Alberta this week, I spoke to a number of organizations around our plan there. And the other thing that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, and that we'll be continuing to build on, and I'll talk about our 2020 plan a little later on, is our research. And our research has been something that has been the cornerstone of the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity for some time, and we plan on building on it as well. So what does public trust mean? Well, this slide says, let's start with a basic agreement. Earning public trust in food and farming is important to the growth, success, and reputation of our industry. And as Tanya mentioned, I spent the last number of years as a deputy minister in Prince Edward Island. My portfolio included agriculture and fisheries and aquaculture. That's essentially the economy of Prince Edward Island. My job and our minister's job was to grow the economy. And when I was thinking about growing that economy and what barriers there were, it wasn't access to capital, it wasn't innovation, it wasn't markets, it wasn't access to land or water. What I saw, the issue being public trust. And it really struck me one night when we went to a meeting in a community. And this community was called Rustico, and it's on the North Shore of Prince Edward Island. And the entire history of Rustico was built around the fishing and farming, particularly the fishery. And we had a company that had an oyster lease in Rustico Bay, and they wanted to expand their footprint just a little bit, not a huge amount. The company is probably one of the best operators that you could get in Atlantic Canada. They also own Cow's Ice Cream, and they make cheese, and some of you may have heard of that product. We went into this room in a community that had its entire history built on the fishery and faced 150 people with their arms folded and a sour look in their face because they did not want to see that oyster farm expand. We had scientists there that talked about how oysters remove nutrients from the water, how they're actually an environmental benefit to put them in there. We had young guys that talked about actually how they don't have to go to Alberta anymore, on how they can work on the oyster farm and put their kids to bed at night. We had the farmer talk about a sustainability plan, the fact that they were certified organic, all this stuff. And it didn't really resonate because the people didn't want that operation there. So then we had to regroup. We had to think about what the values of the people were in the room and how we do a better job of connecting them. Basically told the same stories around the environmental, the sustainability, and the connection to the local economy, but we had to change our messaging. And once we changed our messaging, then we got to a better place. The other thing that struck me was, as deputy, I was responsible for the regulatory piece of agriculture and PEI. And I can tell you almost every time someone pulled out a sprayer, we got a phone call. Almost we had at least one animal welfare complaint every day that we had to deal with. Often they weren't based on anything. They were based on, you know, these cows are outside and it's kind of cold today, or it's windy and they should be inside. So I really saw that public trust was a challenge for us in building the economy, and I think that's the case right across Canada. Yes, there's issues with trade, there's issues with labor, there's all kinds of issues in agriculture. Usually we can kind of figure our way around them, and that's what we need to do with public trust. And the opportunity in agriculture in Canada is significant. And we look at, I just put a slide up there, 3 reports, one from the Senate, one from Dominic Barton, and one from the economic strategy tables. All of them identified agriculture in Canada as a huge growth opportunity. And when Dominic Barton was asked to do his report a couple of years ago, and he was the head of consulting firm McKinsey & Company, he was asked to look at the Canadian economy and see where there was an opportunity for growth. He could have looked at any part of our economy, but he identified agriculture as having the best opportunity for growth. And actually in his report, he said Canada will be one of the top 5 competitors in the agri-food sector, recognized as the most trusted and safe and sustainable supplier. And that's quite a statement when you think of it. So it speaks to the opportunity, but it also speaks to the challenge of how we need to get to a better place in terms of public trust. But when you think about Canada's reputation around the world, I was in a grocery store in China about 3 years ago, and we did a little tour, and it was in a city called Qingdao, and Qingdao has roughly 11 million people in it. Still a second-tier city in China. And we went into this grocery store, and as we were touring the grocery store, I kept seeing these signs in English. And the signs in English also had a Canadian flag attached to them. And they also had, you know, a picture of blueberries or lobster or whatever. And I said to the person touring us, what's the deal with the English signs? And he said, well, most people that come in here can't read them. But they know, because they're in English and because they have a Canadian flag and they have a picture, that says quality, safety, and value. And he said that's what they'll gravitate to. So that's the opportunity that we have in front of us. It's how we get there. And I like to show this map because it speaks to the challenge we have, but it also speaks to the opportunity. So this is a map of the world. And on this slide, the size of the dot is the amount of your income that's spent on food. So the United States has the lowest food cost in the world, 6.8%. Canada, we're second lowest, 9.1. Most of the Europeans are in the teens. Some of the Asian countries are in the teens. A lot of the world, they get up in the morning and they just have to figure out how they, how they can feed themselves, because 30, 40, 50% of their income is spent on food. But by and large, the people that we are marketing to and the people that we're trying to connect to, a fairly small portion of their income is spent on food. So that means that they can make choices. They can say, well, I want non-GMO, or today I'm going to eat beef, tomorrow I'm going to eat fish, the next day I'm going to eat chicken. I can, that's the challenge we have when we have such a small portion of our income spent on food. Now, and I'll tell another little story. My girlfriend came to Canada in 1995. She was 19 years old, came here by herself as a refugee from the war in Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia, and the Bosnian War. And they were refugees in Serbia before she came here. And she said, we get up in the morning and we just tried to figure out how we were going to feed ourselves that day. And she said, Dad would go into one line and Mom would go to another, and I'd try to get a bit of work so that we could get enough food. So when I go shopping with her, her attitude towards groceries is a whole lot different than mine is, or the experience of most Canadians, because we have a different reality where, roughly 10% of our income is spent on food. But we still have that perception that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, that Canadian food is expensive and getting more expensive. So I'm not here to tell stories. I guess what I'm here to do is talk about our public trust tracking data that the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity has been doing for the last number of years. So in 2019, we surveyed 2,189 Canadians across Canada, and our survey is led by Ipsos. So that's who we get to do our work for us. And they tell us that if you want to get a good sample of the industry or the Canadian public, about 2,000 is a good number that you can get there. And our goal, again, is to track and gauge public trust data or public attitudes around Canadian food, to do a comparison to the US, and understand who Canadians trust and who they hold responsible for providing that information. We'll talk a little bit about this. This slide is the demographics of the survey respondents. So Ipsos does a really nice job of making sure that we have the right gender mix, that we have the right age mix, that we have the right education, income, employment, and region. So that, again, it's a pretty neat way that they are able to ensure that we have that cross-section of the Canadian public. So our key findings. So in 2019, we found that consistent with previous years, only 1 in 3 Canadians think that our food system is going in the right direction. That being said, they are the biggest group. I have my phone here. I'm actually going to turn it off in case it starts ringing. We also, as I mentioned, Canadians are most concerned about the rising costs of food, energy, healthcare, and the affordability of healthy food. 4 in 10, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, have altered their meat consumption behaviors in the past year, and more likely to eat less meat than more. And Canadians are more trusting of farmers, less trusting of government, and food processors and manufacturers. I don't think there's any surprise in that information. And there are growing concerns about hormones and the use of hormones in farm animals. And interestingly, a less belief that organic food is more healthful than conventionally grown food. So let's dig into the numbers. So one of the first things we ask people is, do you think the Canadian food system is heading in the right direction? And then we ask them why, and we'll talk about that in a second. And only 35% of Canadians think that we're heading in the right direction. 42% are not sure, and 24% saying, that is in spite of the fact that the Canadian food system is recognized, and there was a study a couple of years ago that looked at 17 OECD countries. Canada and Ireland tied for the best food system in the world. So again, around the world, we're recognized for the quality of our food system, but we're not resonating necessarily with our home people. We are doing better in the US, and we saw a big drop in 2018 to 2019 data in the US. So I called my counterpart in the US and I said, why is that big drop there for 2019 compared to 2018? Is there something happened in the food system? And he said, nope, that's the Trump factor. So in the US right now, any survey that you will see on any topic will have less confidence just because of the political system in the US right now. So in Alberta, Alberta specific numbers, about 25% of Albertans think that the food system is going on the right track. 29% think it's going in the wrong track. Those that think it's going in the wrong track, despite the fact that we have reasonably cheap food, recognize that the rising cost is a big issue. The ones that think it's going in the right direction actually appreciate the standards, the guidelines, and the regulatory system that we have in Canada. So, and nationally, again, Canadians that think it's going in the right direction, again, Albertans are right on track with the rest of Canada. I think that regulation control is where that the strength in the food system. And on the negative side, actually 25% had a whole bunch of reasons, so more personal, but 23% of Canadians who said it's in the wrong track identified it as being expensive and the rising costs. I think part of that is if we look at the food basket when someone goes to a grocery store and they purchase their products, about somewhere in the range, I think I read, from 55 to 65% of the cost in your grocery basket is actual food. The rest of it is dog food, cat food, toilet paper, cleaning supplies, all these other things that add to the cost. So when Canadians may only be thinking about the cost at checkout and not necessarily the cost, because when you go home and you put that away, about half it goes into the cupboard, the rest of it goes somewhere else in the house. You know, you think of the cost of laundry detergent alone. So the other thing we ask Canadians is we give them a whole list of items that they can select from as their top 5 concerns, regardless of whether it's food or whatever. And interestingly enough, 3 of the, actually 4 of the top 5 are related to food. So again, any concern that you have, we mentioned, we talk about climate change, the economy, all kinds of stuff, fuel costs, and they identified the rising cost of food as their #1 issue. Keeping healthy food affordable, and the safety of food. Yeah, it's 3 out of 5. The other ones are energy costs and healthcare. But then if we go down a little farther, climate change, food safety, humane treatment of animals. Having enough food to feed Canada is important, but a low concern is having enough food to feed people outside of Canada. And how many times have we heard over the last 10 years, industry and others saying, well, you know, we're going to have these number of people by 2025, we need to feed the world. That just doesn't resonate with Canadians. And in Alberta, the #1 concern that was recognized was keeping healthy food affordable at 66%. And then the other concerns were very similar to the rest of Canada. And typically, you see the above is the gender breakdown. Females tend to be more concerned about issues than men. That's not really surprising to me. One of the things that we started asking about, and I put a couple of slides in here because I think this is an issue that we're going to see more of going forward, and it is food waste and affordability. And food waste in particular. Canadians are increasingly concerned about the affordability of healthy food. That took a big jump in 18 to 19, but they're also getting more concerned about food waste. And so 64% of Canadians said they do more to try to reduce the amount of food they throw away. So we know Canadians have significant concern around packaging now. That's a fairly new issue, but I think food loss and food waste is going to be the next issue there. And 46% said they're more concerned about the affordability of healthy food than they were a year ago. And again, most people say they try to waste less food than they did in the past. And I'm concerned about food loss and waste. So this is something I think we're going to have to keep our eye on as an industry. And again, there's the numbers for Alberta. And they're, again, very consistent right across Canada. But even though only a third of Canadians feel that the food system is heading in the right direction, they have an overall positive impression of agriculture. And if you go back to the data from 2006, only 41% of Canadians had a positive impression of ag. Prior to 2006, we didn't do a whole lot to tell our story around agriculture. And I think the numbers we're seeing there is the increased effort by government, industry, and the food system to start connecting with Canadians and connecting with our sustainability programs and putting more of an effort into that. So 60% of Canadians in 2019, again, 5% higher than 2018. There was a bit of a drop there, but overall, the impression is fairly strong for agriculture. And in Alberta, 62% of Albertans have a very positive or somewhat positive impression of agriculture, and only 3% have a very negative impression. So when I spoke to the Alberta sugar beet growers on Wednesday, I said, this is an opportunity for you. People like you. People like your industry. So build on that. But when we asked them, what do you know about modern farming practices? 91% of Canadians said, I know very little. I used to have a picture, and tell another story. You'll remember the stories, you won't remember the stats. I had a photo in my office that was about the size of the screen here in this boardroom. And it was a young guy standing in a dairy barn. And almost anyone that came into my office said, I love that photo. I actually should have included it in the deck here. And I said, well, let's talk about that photo. The cows were tied up. Actually, their tails were tied up to keep them out of the poop. There was a fair bit of dust on the floor. The ceiling was about this high above the farmer's head. There was fluorescent lights. There was one little fan in the back of the room. And I said, guess what they've done to that barn? I said, what? They bulldozed it. They built a new barn across the road. And the new barn, cows are free to walk around. They have robotic milkers. They have scratchers. They have natural lighting. They have stable cleaners. They have all the modern conveniences. I said, actually, when the farmer opened the door, the cows won't go outside anymore. They love it in there. And I said, but if you were driving down the road, what barn would you gravitate to? And everyone said, you know what? I would have that emotional response to that old barn that my grandfather had. And that's the challenge that we have in agriculture. Because not only do people not know very much about modern agriculture, they also, as we're going to see in a few minutes, not that sure that they trust it. The nice thing about these numbers, though, is that the next question we ask them is, would you like to know more? And 60% of Canadians said they would like to know more. And the numbers are consistent in Alberta as well. Only 12% of Albertans said they know a lot about farming practices. 9% said they know nothing about it. And then there's a large group of people that know a little bit. But again, the numbers are fairly consistent. Going back to 2016, the 60% want to know more. So that's a great opportunity for government and industry and the food system to work together. And one of the things, and I'm going to have a slide later on, one of the things that really drives trust is transparency. Are you open and transparent about what you do? Now, farmers have the best number of 34% of Canadians think that farmers are doing a pretty good job of being transparent about what they do, but that's still 66% that think we're not. And then you see the rest of the numbers there. They don't have a whole lot of trust in food processors, advocacy groups, or restaurants. And the food processors and the manufacturers one is interesting to a degree. So when we think about 2008, when Maple Leaf Foods had 22 people die from listeria, that should have knocked that company on its butt for many, many years. Michael McCain dealt with that in an open and transparent manner. He said, you know what? We screwed up. We did wrong, and we're gonna make changes. And because he dealt with that quickly and demonstrated that he was being open and took responsibility for that issue, they got to a better place. Then after that, Maple Leaf Foods realized that Canadians are starting to be concerned about food additives. So they've removed most of the food additives from their products, demonstrated that, and then they said, you know what? We also know that Canadians are concerned about environmental and sustainability. They started reporting on that. And they're one of our strongest companies in Canada right now. But it was because they recognized after that incident in 2008 that they had to change the way they did things, be more open and transparent. And it paid off for them. And I think there's a lesson to be learned for our industry as well. And again, there are the numbers. Actually, these are the numbers for different cohorts. So typically Canadians over 35 are more likely to rate farmers and producers as transparent and open. And there's your Alberta numbers. 34%, very, very similar to the rest of Canada. It's interesting though that restaurants score so low, and that's where we need to do a bit of work with the restaurant trade. Then we asked them about a number of questions around crop and animal farming. So 46% of Canadians said they are concerned about pesticides in crop production. They're concerned about hormones in animal production. Here's one that really troubles me. Only 36% of Canadians believe that farm animals should be given antibiotics if they're sick. Like that just doesn't make sense. And I think we need to do a lot more work on that. They're concerned about drug residues in meat, milk, and eggs. They're concerned about drug resistance due to farm animals being given antibiotics. And you see the rest of the numbers here. And again, the deck will be available after the presentation. And then the other ones are on genetic modification. I think we're starting to see a switch away from the concerns around genetic modification. When GMO started to be widely available, I think some of the experts said, you know, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to get to a point where there's a lot of acceptance. We're well past that 5 or 10 years, but I think we are getting to a better place in that. The other one that's interesting is the notion that food grown organically is more healthful than conventional food. Fewer and fewer people actually believe that. And a lot of the messaging has always been that just the opposite. And there are your Alberta numbers. A little lower in terms of pesticides, and I think in Alberta, because of your type of production here, you don't see sprayers quite as often. Where I come from in Prince Edward Island, with this primarily potato production, you're looking at almost a spray a week, where that's a little different situation when you're growing grain and some other crops. But again, GMOs still have 43% concern in Alberta, and antibiotics is another one that, and antibiotics is one I think we're going to see increasing concern about over the next number of years. So we track a number of issues over time, and I'll just speak to these for a minute. So when we ask people about, are they concerned about genetically engineered crops, the numbers are starting to drop from 16 and 17, and I think we're going to continue to see that. And Alberta is bang on with the rest of Canada, and 38% of that. And again, on pesticides, you're a little lower than the average, and we're starting to see some, kind of leveling off of the concern there. And again, females are much more concerned about food issues than males. They're more interested in who's going to win the hockey game on Saturday night. And here's the numbers on organic, and you see quite a drop there from 2018 to 2019, and significantly lower in Alberta. 21% believe that organic food is more healthy. And then here's Canadian numbers on we've already shown on drug residues in meat and the use of hormones in animal production. And the hormone one, you can see it. It's up and down, but it's considerably higher than it was from 2006 to 2012. This is interesting data, and I don't have. I think we have Alberta data on this, and I didn't get it into the deck, but only 32% of people agree that videos of farm animals are representative of normal livestock farming, which is good. The other important piece is 64% of Canadians say that if they feel that animals are treated humanely, they have no problem consuming meat, milk, and eggs. And then they also feel that by and large, they're moderate to strongly agree that Canadian meat is derived from humanely treated animals. Now, only 38% trust the government food system. So I think there's an opportunity where we need to have industry connect with government. And although when you look at why Canadians, the ones that felt that the food system was going in the right track, they recognize their regulatory system, but they don't necessarily trust it as strongly as they should. And only 40% think that farmers are good stewards of the land. And there is a stronger agreement on Canadian food being more trusted than food produced outside of Canada. People are more and more concerned and curious, I guess, maybe that's not the right word, about food labels. When you're seeing non-GMO claims on things that can't be GMO, like certain breads, or I bought a box of salt the other day and it said non-GMO salt. What the heck's that? That's so people are getting more concerned with that. They're also concerned about mislabeling, adulterating, or counterfeiting food products. That's more in the fishery than it is in agriculture. So one of the things that we started asking last year is on meat consumption, just to get a sense of where people are on that. But only 2% of Canadians say they don't eat, never eat meat. And vast majority of it eat once a day, 2 times a week, or at least once a week. So 92% of Canadians consume meat at least once a week. So we think that you would think, if you're listening to the media, that those numbers are dropping, and they are a little bit, but there's still a strong connection to meat. And females tend to eat less than males, but still the numbers are very strong. And only 1% of males never eat meat, where 4% of females are in that bucket. Albertans, you guys love meat. Only 1% of the population here never eat meat. And the vast majority of you eat it once a day or more, or 2 to 4 times a week. Yeah. And how do non-meat eaters identify? 77% say they're vegetarian, only 15% say vegan, and then some of them don't identify as either. And I was chatting with the University of Guelph professor, Mike von Massow, a little while ago, and he had done some work on vegans and vegetarians, and he said they were doing a study, and I forget what the study was on, But he said one of the things that came out of it was that there were people who are identifying as vegetarian or vegan that actually eat meat fairly often. And they would identify as vegetarian or vegan basically because they thought it was cool, not necessarily because that's what their beliefs were. But we did see that most Canadians say their meat consumption has been stable, but those who have said that it changed are more likely to eat less than to eat more. And then when we ask them why it's decreased, a lot of them identify price and cost, and they're watching their weight, those types of things. People that increased, there's very few of them, just like the taste, but they also recognize, it's interesting that those who increased their meat consumption identify as health, but those that decreased identify as health. Yeah. So next week, we have a webinar on March 10th. David Coletto is with Abacus Data, and he'll do a fairly deep dive into meatless revolution or temporary fat. And so David has some pretty interesting data on that he'll present through the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. We also will be posting that on our website following. So if you can't log in that day, feel free to go on our website and check that out. But I think you'll like David's data. The report from his results will also be made available to anyone that signs into the webinar as well. So we'll make the webinar available and the video of it, plus the data that David will present. So one of the other things we asked, how are we doing for time? We're pretty good. Who do consumers trust? By and large, Canadians hold farmers responsible for providing the information, but they also trust them the most. And then behind that, university researchers are trusted, ag overall, but they also find food manufacturers and processors, but also agribusiness are lumped in there. Government has a strong responsibility from the public too in terms of providing that information. So the ones that trust Canadian agriculture, they identified that they see farmers and the farming industry as reliable, honest, trustworthy, well-regulated, ethical, and that they provide a good product. And that's the ag side of it. Those that trust the food system, again, identified that the regulations, the guidelines, the controls, the inspections are the reasons why they trust that piece of the puzzle. So when we ask people, who do you want to hear from on particular issues? And this is important for, I think in particular for industry. So industry is speaking about farming and environment. They know that 66% of Canadians want to hear from farmers, but they also want to hear from university professors and environmental engineers alike. So what industry can do is lead with a farmer, but make those connections to a researcher or someone else that can advocate on your behalf. And the guys at the sugar beet meeting the other day, I told them, you guys are a lot more credible than David Suzuki. And they like that. They like that. And you can see his numbers on there. But well-known celebrities are really not that credible among, we think they are, but they're not. And then Albertans are the same. If you want to hear from someone on the farming and environmental issues, 71% said I want to hear from a farmer. But less so an association representing farmers. So the association may need to take the background, but allow a farmer who's good at telling a story to come to the forefront. And then with animal welfare, people really trust the opinion and values of a veterinarian. So again, if we're going to talk to the public around animal welfare, you maybe lead with the veterinarian and connect also with the farmer because they're very close as well. And there's the numbers in Alberta. If you're talking about nutrition, dietitian is most trusted, doctors, university food professor, and then the farmer. So again, depending on what story we're trying to tell, then we we think about who is the best one to present that information. And there's the numbers, and again, very similar here in Alberta. And then if you talk about farming and food safety, again, farmers, dietitians, and doctors. So it's important to think about who is presenting your message as much as what the message is. There's the Alberta numbers. So I just threw a slide in here on change. So our food system is changing so rapidly, and that's affecting people's concerns and questions around the industry. Up in the corner there, you see a 3D, I think that's a 3D food printer. I was in Iceland a couple of years ago at a conference, and they demonstrated a 3D food printer. And so this thing created a pizza and cooked it in front of us. And the presenter, and it was called the Foodini. And the presenter said, you know, we think that these things will replace the microwave in 10 to 15 years time. I'm not so sure of that, but all we know is that technology is changing. You know, who would have heard of Uber Eats or the skip the dishes and that type of thing here a few years ago? And Amazon now is into grocery stores. And a lot of this change is led by this guy at the end of the table. And this is an interesting story. You probably heard of this guy. His name is Jack Ma. And Jack Ma in the early 90s was teaching school for $12 a week in China. And he was one of 24 people that applied for a job at Kentucky Fried Chicken in China. 23 got hired. Jack didn't get the nod. But somebody introduced him to the internet in 1995. And in 1999, he had 10 people gather with him in his living room. And he said, you know what? I think this internet is going to be something where people will buy products online. And he started Alibaba. And Alibaba is the biggest retailer in the world right now. And the 10 people that Jack Ma had in his room with him that day, every one of them is a billionaire today. So, and Alibaba has moved from not only being online, but now they have grocery stores. And in those grocery stores, there's no cashiers, it's scan and go. They're using artificial intelligence to identify what people have purchased in the past and to help nudge them go in certain ways. They have digital price tags that talk about the attributes of the product. And you know, and I could throw all kinds of other slides. You know, in Australia, the beef industry is using blockchain to help trace where their product came from and where it went to. And experiential retail is something that is starting to grow. And in Toronto, there's a new store called Italy. And I went to Italy a little while ago just to do a bit of a tour there. 50,000 square feet. There's 9 restaurants within the grocery store. There's people buying wine and they're drinking wine and they got a basket under their arm. It's all about the experience. And if you think about the fact that 9 to 10% of our income is spent on food, it's all about disconnecting people from the money in their wallet and doing that experience. And the other thing that we're seeing more and more of is this pick and have cooked. So what people are doing in the stores at Italy and around the world is, I'll buy this, but then they'll cook it for you and you can either eat it there or take it home. All these changes in the food system impact the way consumers think about it. And we as an industry have to be on top of what these changes are. But the number one thing that's driving change in the food industry is transparency. So if you look at any report on food trends, transparency will be listed as one of the top key drivers. And then in the information age, consumers demand stronger communication and transparency. If you don't provide it, they'll move on. The other thing with labor shortages, if we're trying to attract people to our industry, we need to be transparent about what we do too. And the old model of communication, where you'd have an expert, and you'd talk to the consumers, and you'd have lots of data that used to work. Guess what? It doesn't anymore. People get information from a variety of sources. And here's a little bit of data just on the internet use in Canada. So if you have internet access in Canada, there's an 80% chance that you're going to be on Facebook. And LinkedIn or Instagram or some of the other social media platforms. So we need to think about how we can get our messaging across in a new model that doesn't necessarily fit with what we're used to. And then if you find out, where do you hear about a new product? Most people say they get it from friends and acquaintances, but once they hear about it, first place they go to is the internet to find out more. So we need to think about our social media strategy as we're trying to communicate to the general public. And then that's just a little bit of data that'll be in the slide on different age cohorts or in different parts of social media. So depending on the audience you want to speak to, you think about what platform you want to work under. What resonates with Canadians? One of the things that we did last year, we looked at artificial intelligence and we looked at 250,000 conversations online. And the goal was to discover what Canadians are talking about in the food system, but then to identify what messages might change their attitude over time. So these are the messages around modern farming, antibiotics, pesticides, and GMOs. A lot of them are connected to climate change. So if you can identify how pesticides reduce greenhouse gases or make your food safer, then there's a better chance that it'll resonate with the public. GMOs, again, it's climate change and pesticides. Antibiotics is around food safety, and then modern farming is a lot of it's around animal welfare and regulation. We have we're just coming up to the end here. We have a research committee that leads the research that's conducted by the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, and they're listed there from mostly from different provinces. We will be adding some new folks to our research committee, and what we're adding are people that can just ask the question why. Because right now we have a research committee made up primarily of researchers. I want to have food system people that can just say, well, what if or what about, and ask the question, and then these folks can help design the research. So for 2020, we'll be again doing, and I know it'll be more than 2,000 respondents because we've already identified some areas that we're going to add to that number. And again, we'll be tracking public attitude. Our interest cell this year, we're going to expand and look at why do people make certain choices in restaurants that they might not make at home, and what's the motivation behind that. We're going to dive a little deeper into food loss and waste and environment. We're also going to look at some data analysis to see if there's changes. We know Quebec has slightly different numbers than the rest of Canada. Why is that happening? And then we're also going to look at what are the deeper dives into Canada, US, and in Europe. And I can't remember if that's the last slide. No, it's not. This is the last one. So if you want to learn more, one of the things that the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity does every year is we offer a summit. Last year we were in Saskatoon. This year we're in Toronto at the Resource Library on October 14th and 15th. We've already identified a number of speakers and workshops. We will have a really neat workshop speaking to social media. We'll have a social media guru there who'll talk a lot deeper into what I presented on how to connect with Canadians, what platforms to use, what language works, what model works. We're also going to have a presentation from a psychoanalyst, someone who can help us figure out the psyche of the Canadian consumer and how to best connect with that. Edelman is a big communications firm. The CEO of Edelman will be there to talk about what work they're doing on connecting with millennials, Gen Z, and so it'll be a great lineup. If you want to learn more, feel free. So if we have questions, I'll try and answer them, and if not, I'll make something up and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. If you're going to ask a question in the room, I just ask that you come to the front so everybody could hear it online. So one of the first questions, it was referring quite earlier on in the slide deck, but is the price sensitivity result of our economy issues?
I don't think so, because I think if we economy issues are transitory, and we know that these concerns around high cost of food, I think, go back a number of years. And in some provinces, the numbers are fairly consistent across Canada. And there's some provinces, like the province I came from, Prince Edward Island, it's booming right now. You can hardly get a house built because there's such a demand. But there's still a big concern around food prices. So I don't think it's related to the economy, but it might be something that we may want to explore a bit further.
Do you think our federal government organic standards, which excludes the use of GMOs, example in livestock feeds, vaccinations, contributes to the impression that GMOs are bad? So this individual says, well, I understand the desire to ensure clarity in the advertising around the term organic. Prescriptive standards that aren't grounded in any scientific validity seems to be rendering rather than intelligently guided purchasing.
I got to be careful on how I answer this one, but I think there's some validity to that comment, and the fact that I think the organic standards are, correct me if I'm wrong, have been designed not just by government, but the industry itself helped design those standards, and the industry identified early on that they didn't want GMOs as part of the mix. And the notion that something is better because it's non-GMO really troubles me, and I don't know how it, and that's one of the problems we have with the food system. And I have an issue with someone building themselves up by tearing someone else down. They're saying, you know, we're better because we're organic. And I remember as a deputy going to the organic growers meetings, and it was always interesting because even within the organization, they struggle, because some of them would say, well, someone who had a 1,000-acre organic farm, well, you're corporate organic, so you're not really organic. We're 2 acres. We're the real organic people. So and I used to struggle with that, and I still do, because any food system, whether it's organic or conventional, and think about it, most organic production and conventional production share about 90% of their practices or more. But any system actually has merits on its own. So you're better off speaking to the merits of your system, because if you're trying to build yourself up by tearing someone else down or presenting the notion that the science is solid on GMOs and has been for many, many years, and the fact that we still have bread companies saying that, we have non-GMO wheat in them. Well, I think the problem is we should have GMO wheat. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with it. Even we don't have it, but or this, I mentioned earlier, buying salt that said it was non-GMO, or some of these things that are out there. It's I don't know. I think we need to do a better job of standing up and responding to some of this stuff. I don't know if I answered the question, but I struggle with it as well. And I think the person asking the question and I are on the same track.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated one as well. So.
Yeah.
Another question is,
if I could just add something, and it just came to mind. I saw a press release either yesterday or the day before. The Food and Drug Administration in the US, and you should look this up, are actually launching a campaign as a government agency to promote the safety of genetic modification in the US. And they've got a whole series of information and a plan that they plan to launch. So it's interesting that a government agency in the US, and it's through the USDA, is actually launching, and there was a press release, I think it came out on Wednesday, that said that this is a new campaign that they're going to launch just to talk about GMOs. Probably should think about replicating something like that again.
Do consumers actually open their wallets for increased transparency and metrics regarding impact of their food choices on the environment? Or do they continue to look at the lowest cost product when it comes to what they put in their grocery basket?
The data that I used to see, and I don't know if it's changed, is about 4% of Canadians will buy on attributes. But if you need to be in the game, you also need to connect to sustainability. So I saw something the other day, and it was relating in the seafood industry, that 70% of people who are buying seafood are more apt to buy it if they think it came from a sustainable system. And when we think about what the consumer considers sustainable, it's environmental. Like for us, it's social, it's economic, but the person on the street, they focus on the environmental. I think that many people look at the lowest cost, but I also think that if you want to be in the game, you need to connect. And it's not just about selling more or getting more. It's about having that freedom to do your business. So we need Canadians to understand that our farmers are doing a better job of environmental stewardship. And I think also that Canadians don't expect perfection, but they do expect progress. So if you can identify how you're making progress in terms of it, and a lot of what we do, we export too. We have to remember that a lot of our products in Canada are exported. We only have so many people here. We produce a lot more food than we can consume. So if we want to, again, grow our economy, we need to think about being able to tell that story for reasons other than just being able to sell, because it's also the freedom to produce.
That's great, thanks. I guess you spoke about markets. There's a question, can you please speak about the Canadian food system in the context of European standards? Do we fully meet their standards?
You know what? I don't know. In openness and transparency, I have no idea.
That's the first step, admitting you don't know.
Yeah.
And truly, yeah, there's niche markets that could be developed, but like you said, our own consumers are not aware of our entire food system anyway, right?
Yeah.
Okay, here's an interesting, non-GMO salt. Any thoughts on gluten-free water? The new age of misinformation and fake news. What is the CCFI doing, if anything, on consumer food literacy? Is the appropriate channel still via farmers?
I think it is, but I talked earlier in the deck about one of the things that the CCFI wants to do this year is a proactive and reactive communications plan. And that's what we were talking to a number of our partner organizations in Alberta this week. So in terms of the proactive piece, it's talking about, and one of the pillars in there is food safety and health. And we want to provide proper information to Canadians. And we think as a CCFI, based on our research and who we are, as we're not necessarily an industry association, that we may be a good vehicle to present that information. We also know the government of Canada announced a Buy Canada program, which is a $25 million program over 5 years. They've sent an RPF out on a portion of that to marketing companies. Year 1 and year 2 is about telling the true story of Canadian food. And I think that's where we are connecting to that program to make sure that the proper information gets out to the consumer, so that it's really all about the consumer making informed choices. So the best thing we can do is to arm the consumer to know that gluten-free water is horse shit. And pardon my French, but yeah, but that's the best thing we can do as an industry. And I think we're positioned, and we've identified that as something that we need to take on.
Good answer. I think you've already alluded to it and somewhat answered it, but I'll just put it out there again. So the concerns from consumers and Canadians is really an opportunity, such as the food waste or the antibiotics. Do you agree? Because there is lots of concern in those areas.
Well, if people are concerned, they may be more open to hearing information. So I think it's an opportunity. And we can't fault the consumer for being concerned about certain things. We also, as an industry, conversation is a two-way street. we also have to listen to the concerns of the consumers, and maybe we need to adjust things when we have to. Because like I said, I don't think the consumer expects perfection, but they do expect progress. And I think we have to listen to those concerns as well.
Just open it up to the room. Is there any questions?
I've got a few. So I may have to wait till 2020 for this one, but I did know that in the earlier slides, like when we talked about this is going in the right direction.
Yeah.
Quebec was substantially higher in their belief of that. Do we have a rationale? as
No,
to-
and that's actually something
Okay.
we've identified on why we want to look at that. Why is there a regional difference there that we're not seeing in the rest of Canada? Is there something happening in Quebec that is creating that? You know, they do have a program in Quebec called Aliment du Québec, which identifies Quebec produced or processed food. You can go into a grocery store there, you can pick out Quebec products like that. So I don't know if that's driving that higher confidence in the food system there. Something that we definitely want to look at.
I'll look forward to 2020.
Yeah.
For that one. I have more on myself. Okay, I'll scoot closer as well. So on the earlier slides about the pesticides and concerns with pesticides, I think there was some age breakdown demographics in there. I was wondering if we could cycle back or if you could speak more to, because I thought at a glance that there was higher concern about use of pesticides and the like from plus 55s, I thought I saw, compared to younger 18s or whatever the
It might
range
be.
was. Yeah.
This is transparency. No. Pesticides there. Oh, wait, no, it's a key group. No, that's provinces.
Yeah, I think it was in this section. Yeah, so pesticides, sorry. So I was just curious, so with this breakdown, the 18 to 34, 55 plus.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to ask, I'd have to do a little deeper dive into our data. We would have some data on that. I don't have it at my fingertip, but that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. I personally
Yeah.
am really fascinating, especially because generally speaking, people say younger generations are more informed consumers. They're the ones that are online, want more information,
Yeah.
are maybe looking at less meat-based diet, have more of these concerns. So to see that it's, well, 55 plus in this case are more.
And it's significantly, it's statistically higher. Yeah.
So I'm fascinated to know why that's.
Silent Spring.
Yeah,
Influence
say
of Silent
DDT,
Spring in the 70s.
They know about it.
Yeah, if you read that, that's where that.
Maybe that's your old hippies.
Yeah. That impacted the generation.
Someone said to me, if there's going to be a generation that's going to legalize pot, it's this group now, you know.
They're also facing their own mortality, so they get more concerned. about
Yeah,
what they
the closer you are to the grave, the more concern you have for your health.
So yeah, if we can hear more, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah.
I have one last question. That's one I've thought of a few times. I was just wondering if integrity has much thought on it. When we talk about trust in organizations, government always tends to be on that lower side of trust.
Yeah.
Is there any thought being given to when that question is posed or asked, admittedly, I've not looked at the exact wording? Because I have concerns like we as a province, as staff, we consider ourselves government that, but I do wonder when we put it to the general public, when you say government, do you view it as the premier? Do you view it as?
I think we'd have to do a deeper dive into that, but I think when my guess and coming from working in government is that they're seeing it as the elected officials. And, you know, we are in a Westminster system that the elected officials are the heads of our governments. I think that, but we'll do a deeper dive into that. But my guess is they're thinking of the, you know, and yeah, I get the handcuffs are off now. I'm not a deputy anymore. Like, you know, the messages are pretty canned for the people that go in front of a camera. And I think people are seeing that. And it's been that way for a number of years now. We're not, our political leaders, there's very few of them like John Crosby, for example, in Newfoundland. He used to just say what he thought. And a lot of it's, you know, it's pretty packaged. And I think that's I think that's a reflection of what we're seeing there.
Well, that makes-
And I'm only guessing, but you know,
Well,
that'd be
that-
my.
that makes sense, because I have often wondered from our role as government people engaging with whomever, which area of ag we engage with. We often hear back some anecdotally that what we provide is good and works, and it works for them.
But I think there's some numbers there, and I won't bother pulling them up, but you can look at them later. I think when we identify, for example, a government scientist is even scored less than a university scientist. So it's just, and I go back to that meeting I talked about in Rustigo where we had government scientists talking about the benefit of having oysters in a bay. They didn't want to hear from them. You know, it was just the level of trust across government. But I think mostly people are thinking about the elected officials, but not me anymore. You guys are aware a bit too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there's no more questions coming in. So that closes out today's session. Thank you for everybody joining the 2019 Public Trust Research Connecting with Canadians, presented by John. And this concludes our session for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.